The people who should have protected her were the very ones who destroyed everything she believed in. At 23 years old, a young woman's entire world shattered into a million pieces when the two men she trusted most crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. This isn't just a story about betrayal. This is a story about trust, broken in the most horrific way possible, by the people who called themselves family, by the men who were supposed to be her protectors. And when the truth finally came out, justice took a form that nobody expected. Some call it revenge, others call it justice. But before you judge, you need to hear the whole story. Because this case isn't black and white. It's covered in the darkest shades of gray you could ever imagine. Before we go any further into this heartbreaking story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Trust me, you're going to want to stay for every single second of this one. Her name, for the purpose of this story, was Sarah, 23 years old, working 2 jobs to save money for graduate school, with dreams that stretched far beyond the small Texas town she'd grown up in. She was the kind of woman who always had a smile ready, who worked hard for everything she had, who believed in the goodness of people because that's what her family had taught her. Family meant everything to Sarah. It meant loyalty. It meant safety. It meant people who would stand by you no matter what. She lived in a modest apartment close to her childhood home, nothing fancy, but it was hers, a symbol of her independence and her ambitions. Sarah had 2 older brothers, Tyler and Marcus, who she absolutely adored. Tyler was 28, married with a kid on the way, working in construction and building a life for his young family. Marcus was 30, quieter but equally devoted to his little sister. Despite their age gaps and different fathers, the 3 of them had always been close. They'd been through so much together growing up. Their family wasn't perfect, far from it actually, but they had each other, and that bond was unbreakable. They called her their little sunshine, even though she wasn't little anymore, because she'd always been the one to bring light into their lives, the optimist, the dreamer, the one who saw the good in everyone. Then there was Richard, Sarah's stepfather. He'd been in her life since she was about 10 years old, after he married their mother, Patricia. Richard was a big man in his early 50s now, worked construction most of his life, always had dirt under his fingernails and calluses on his hands. To the outside world, he seemed like a decent enough guy. He provided for the family when Patricia struggled financially. He showed up to family dinners. He was there. Patricia had loved him once, or at least she seemed to. She'd been through 2 previous relationships that didn't work out, struggling to raise 3 kids mostly on her own. When Richard came along, he represented stability, security, someone to help shoulder the burden. And then there was Uncle David, Patricia's younger brother, now in his mid-40s. He'd always been around, maybe too much looking back on it, but nobody questioned it at the time. He was family. He'd come over for Sunday dinners. He'd watch football with Richard. He'd sometimes help Sarah move furniture in her apartment or fix things when they broke. She thought he was kind. She thought he cared about her. Patricia trusted him completely after all. He was her brother, her own flesh and blood. What reason would she have to ever doubt him? Sarah had known Uncle David her entire life. He'd been at every birthday party, every family gathering, every major milestone. He was supposed to be safe. But here's the thing about predators. They don't look like monsters. They look like ordinary people. They smile at you. They earn your trust over years, sometimes decades. They wait for the perfect moment when nobody else is watching. And Sarah, she had no idea that the 2 men she saw at family gatherings, the 2 men who sat at her mother's dinner table, who were supposed to protect her, were the very ones she needed protection from. She was an adult, yes, but she was still vulnerable in ways she didn't even realize, still trusting, still believing that family meant safety, still holding on to the belief that the people who had known her since childhood would never, ever hurt her in ways that would change her forever. But if you looked close enough, if you paid attention to the small details, the tiny cracks in the facade, you might have seen that something wasn't quite right. Over the past year, Sarah had started pulling away from family gatherings. Nothing dramatic at first, just small changes that could have been explained away as a busy young adult building her own life. She started making excuses not to come to Sunday dinners. She'd say she had to work, or she was tired, or she wasn't feeling well. Her brothers noticed but figured she was just growing up, becoming more independent, maybe dating someone she hadn't told them about yet. Tyler noticed that when Sarah did show up to family events, she seemed uncomfortable, especially when Richard or Uncle David were around. She'd position herself across the room from them. She'd leave early. She'd seem distracted and anxious. He asked her once if everything was okay, and she gave him that same smile she always did and said she was just stressed about work and school applications. He believed her because why wouldn't he? She was his little sister. Surely she'd tell him if something was wrong. Right? Marcus noticed it too. He'd call her to hang out like they used to, maybe grab dinner or see a movie, and she'd always have an excuse. The sister who used to call him every other day was now distant, unreachable, like there was a wall between them that hadn't been there before. And then there were the moments that, looking back, were red flags waving violently in the wind. Like the time at Patricia's birthday party 6 months ago, when Sarah showed up late and left within an hour, barely speaking to anyone. Or the Christmas gathering where Uncle David cornered her in the kitchen to talk. And when Tyler walked in, Sarah's face was pale, her hands were shaking, and she immediately excused herself and left the house entirely, claiming she'd gotten a call from work. Or the time Richard offered to help Sarah fix a leaking pipe in her apartment, and she firmly, almost desperately, told him no, she'd hire a professional. She didn't need his help. Patricia was too caught up in her own life to notice the changes. She was working long hours at the hospital where she'd finally gotten her nursing degree years ago. She was dealing with her own health issues, and when she did see her daughter, Sarah put on a brave face. She smiled, she hugged her mother, she said all the right things. But her eyes told a different story if anyone had been paying close enough attention. There was a sadness there, a heaviness that hadn't been there a year ago. A wariness that didn't belong in someone so young, someone with so much ahead of her. There was one incident about 3 months before everything came crashing down, where Marcus stopped by Sarah's apartment unannounced to drop off some mail that had been delivered to their mom's house by mistake. When Sarah opened the door, her eyes were red like she'd been crying, and there were dark circles under them like she hadn't been sleeping. He asked her what was wrong, and she said she'd just had a bad day at work. Nothing serious. He offered to stay and talk, but she said she was fine. She just wanted to be alone. He left feeling uneasy, like there was something she wasn't telling him, something big, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what. He mentioned it to Tyler later, and they both agreed they'd try to spend more time with her, check in more often, make sure she knew they were there for her. But they had no idea what was really going on. No idea that behind the smile and the excuses, Sarah was carrying a secret so dark, so heavy, that it was crushing her spirit piece by piece. A secret about what Richard and Uncle David had done. A secret about a betrayal so profound that it would eventually tear their entire family apart and end in a tragedy that would make national headlines. Because secrets like this, secrets this terrible, they don't stay buried forever. Eventually, the truth finds a way to claw its way to the surface, and when it did, when Sarah's secret finally came out, it would set off a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. Events that would end in blood, in loss, in questions about justice and revenge that still don't have clear answers. It started about a year ago, on a night that seemed like any other. Sarah had agreed, reluctantly, to house sit for her mother who was going out of town for a nursing conference. Patricia had asked her weeks in advance, and Sarah had run out of excuses to say no without raising suspicion. She'd hoped maybe she could avoid being alone in the house by timing her stay during the day, but Patricia's flight was early morning, which meant Sarah had to spend the night there. Richard was supposed to be out of town for a construction job, or at least that's what he'd told Patricia. That was the only reason Sarah had agreed. She arrived at her childhood home around 8 in the evening, let herself in with her key, and immediately felt that familiar knot forming in her stomach. This house held so many memories, some good from her childhood, but others she'd been trying desperately to forget. She locked all the doors, checked them twice, and settled into the guest room upstairs, as far away from the master bedroom as possible. She turned on the TV for background noise, anything to make the house feel less empty, less suffocating. She kept her phone close. Tyler and Marcus were just one call away if she needed them. Around 10 o'clock, she heard a sound downstairs. Her heart stopped. She muted the TV and listened, hoping she'd imagined it, hoping it was just the house settling. But then she heard it again. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the first floor. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She thought about calling 911, but what if it was just Patricia coming back early? What if it was nothing and she was overreacting? Then she heard a voice, a male voice, calling her name. "Sarah? You up there?" It was Richard. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be 200 miles away on a job site. But there he was, in the house, and she was alone with him. She didn't answer. She quietly locked the guest room door and backed away from it, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might explode. She could hear him coming up the stairs now, his footsteps getting closer. "Sarah, I know you're here. Your car's in the driveway." He stopped outside the guest room door. "Open up. We need to talk." She stood frozen, every instinct screaming at her to stay quiet, to not engage, to wait him out. "Come on, Sarah, don't be like that." His voice had that edge to it, that tone she'd learned to recognize and fear. She heard the doorknob rattle as he tried to open it. "Sarah, open this door." She finally found her voice shaky and small. "Mom didn't tell me you were coming back early. I'm trying to sleep. Can we talk in the morning?" There was a pause, a long, terrible silence that felt like it lasted forever. Then he laughed, a sound that made her skin crawl. "I'm not asking, Sarah. Open the door." When she didn't respond, didn't move, she heard him walk away. For a moment she thought maybe he'd given up, maybe he'd leave her alone. But then she heard another sound, another set of footsteps on the stairs, and another voice joined Richard's. Uncle David. They'd planned this, the two of them. They knew Patricia would be gone. They knew Sarah would be here alone. What happened next is something that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. The two men, the stepfather who'd been in her life for over a decade, and the uncle she'd known since birth, worked together to remove the guest room door from its hinges. Sarah screamed, threatened to call the police, begged them to leave her alone. But they didn't stop. When the door came off, she tried to run past them, tried to escape. But Richard grabbed her, his grip like iron, and dragged her back into the room. Uncle David closed in behind them, blocking her only exit. She fought. God, she fought with everything she had. She scratched, she kicked, she screamed until her throat was raw. But it wasn't enough. She was one woman against two grown men who were significantly stronger and had no intention of stopping. The betrayal in that moment, the absolute shattering of any remaining trust or hope Sarah had held on to, was beyond measure. These were men who had been part of her life for years, men who were supposed to be family, men who had watched her grow up, celebrated her achievements, pretended to care about her well-being. But instead, they became the source of her deepest trauma, her darkest nightmare, a violation so profound that it would change who she was at her very core. I won't go into graphic details about what they did to her that night, because Sarah's pain, Sarah's violation, is not entertainment. It's not a story to be sensationalized or turned into graphic content for clicks and views. But what you need to understand is this. In those hours, something inside Sarah broke that would take years to repair, if it ever could be repaired at all. Her sense of safety, destroyed. Her ability to trust, shattered. Her belief that she had any control over her own body, her own life, completely obliterated. When it was finally over, When they finally left her alone in that room, she lay on the floor in the fetal position, unable to move, unable to think, unable to process what had just happened. She could hear them downstairs, talking casually, like they'd just finished watching a football game together, like they hadn't just committed one of the most heinous acts of betrayal imaginable. Sarah eventually pulled herself up, her whole body shaking, every movement causing pain. She grabbed her clothes, got dressed with trembling hands, and had one thought pounding through her mind. Get out. Get out of this house. Get away from them. She had to get out. She grabbed her keys and her phone and made her way down the stairs on unsteady legs. Richard and Uncle David were in the living room, and when she appeared, they both looked at her. Uncle David stood up, started to say something, but Sarah didn't stop. She didn't look at them. She walked straight to the front door, unlocked it, and walked out into the night. She got into her car and drove, not to her apartment, not to Tyler's house, not anywhere logical. She just drove, aimlessly, for hours, until she finally pulled into a 24-hour diner parking lot and sat there as the sun came up, trying to figure out what the hell she was supposed to do now. The days following that night were a blur of numbness and terror. Sarah called in sick to both her jobs. She locked herself in her apartment, barely ate, barely slept, jumped at every sound. She ignored calls from her mother, from her brothers, from friends. She couldn't talk to anyone. What would she even say? How do you explain to your family that the men they trust, the men who sit at the dinner table with them, are monsters? Who would believe her? Richard was Patricia's husband. David was Patricia's brother. They'd been part of this family for years. And Sarah was just the daughter who'd been pulling away, who'd been distant, who might be having mental health issues or going through something they didn't understand. The shame Sarah felt was overwhelming, even though logically she knew it wasn't her fault. But that's what trauma does. It makes you question everything, even when you're the victim. She took 3 showers a day trying to feel clean, but she never did. She couldn't look at herself in the mirror without seeing that night replay in her mind. She couldn't close her eyes without seeing their faces, feeling their hands, hearing their voices. She'd wake up screaming from nightmares, convinced they were in her apartment, coming for her again. She developed panic attacks, her chest tightening, her breath coming in short gasps, her vision tunneling whenever she thought she saw someone who looked like Richard or David. 2 weeks passed, and Sarah knew she couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep this secret, not anymore. It was killing her from the inside out, eating away at her sanity, destroying any chance she had at moving forward with her life. She needed to tell someone, even if they didn't believe her, even if everything fell apart. She needed someone to know the truth. So she called Marcus. When he answered, relief flooding his voice because he'd been so worried about her, she started crying before she could even get the words out. He immediately said he was coming over, and 20 minutes later, he was at her door. When Marcus saw his sister, really saw her, he was shocked. She'd lost weight, her eyes were hollow, her skin was pale, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. He asked her what was wrong, what happened, why she'd been avoiding everyone. And Sarah, sitting on her couch with her brother beside her, finally told him everything, every horrific detail from that night. How Richard and David had planned it, how they'd trapped her in that room, how they'd violated her in ways that made Marcus's blood run cold. She watched his face as she talked, watched the disbelief turn to horror, turn to rage. When she finished, she was crying so hard she could barely breathe. And Marcus looked like he wanted to tear the world apart with his bare hands. "Why didn't you call me that night?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell me right away?" Sarah shook her head. "I didn't know what to do. I was scared. I didn't think anyone would believe me." Marcus pulled her into a hug, holding her tight while she sobbed against his shoulder. "I believe you," he said fiercely. "I believe every word. And I swear to God, Sarah, they're going to pay for this. Both of them." He pulled out his phone and called Tyler, told him to get to Sarah's apartment immediately. It was an emergency. When Tyler arrived 30 minutes later, Marcus made Sarah tell the story again, and Tyler's reaction was identical. Shock, horror, rage, and an immediate, unshakable belief in his sister. The three of them sat in Sarah's living room for hours, talking about what to do next. Sarah didn't want to go to the police. She was terrified of what that would mean, of having to relive the trauma in interviews and examinations, of potentially going through a trial where Richard and David's lawyers would tear her apart on the stand. She'd heard enough stories about how the system treats victims, especially in cases where it's family members and there's no physical evidence anymore because weeks had passed. Tyler and Marcus wanted to go directly to Richard and David's houses and handle this their own way, but Sarah begged them not to. "Please," she said, "please don't do anything that's going to put you in jail. I can't lose you two. You're all I have left." So they made a plan. They'd tell their mother first, let Patricia know what her husband and her brother had done, and let her decide whether to bring in the police. It was the most painful conversation they'd ever have to have, but it needed to happen. Patricia deserved to know the truth about the men in her life. They decided they'd go to her house the next day, when Richard was at work, and tell her everything. Sarah was terrified of how her mother would react. Would she believe her? Would she choose Richard over her daughter? Would she accuse Sarah of lying? These thoughts kept Sarah up all night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if tomorrow would bring justice or more pain. If you're still here watching this, type, "I'm still here," in the comments. I need to know if you're still with me, because what comes next is going to be even harder to hear. This story, Sarah's story, represents something that happens more often than any of us want to admit. Family betrayal, abuse by people we're supposed to trust, and the impossible decisions victims have to make about whether to come forward, whether to report, whether to risk everything to seek justice. Do you believe family betrayal is worse than betrayal by a stranger? Type yes or no in the comments, because that's what this case ultimately asks us to consider. When the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who hurt you most, where do you turn? Who do you trust? And how do you move forward when the very foundation of your life has been destroyed? Stay with me, because Sarah's story is far from over, and what happens next will force you to question everything you thought you knew about justice, revenge, and the lengths people will go to protect the ones they love. The next morning, Sarah, Tyler, and Marcus drove to Patricia's house. Tyler had called ahead and made sure Richard would be at work. He'd actually called Richard's job site and confirmed he was there before they left. When they arrived, Patricia was surprised but happy to see all three of her children together. She kept saying how rare it was nowadays for them all to be in the same place. She made coffee, asked about their lives, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to hit her. Tyler and Marcus let Sarah take the lead, flanking her on either side for support, and when Patricia finally sat down and asked what this was all about, Sarah took a deep breath and told her mother everything. Patricia's reaction was something none of them would ever forget. At first, she seemed confused, like she couldn't quite process what Sarah was saying. Then came the denial. "No," Patricia said, shaking her head. "No, you must be mistaken. Richard wouldn't, David wouldn't, they wouldn't do something like that." Sarah had expected this, but it still hurt, still felt like another betrayal piled on top of the first one. Tyler jumped in, his voice firm. "Mom, Sarah isn't lying. Look at her. Really look at her. She's been destroyed by this." Marcus added, "We believe her, Mom, and you need to believe her too." Patricia looked at her daughter, really looked at her for the first time in weeks, and seemed to finally see the damage, the pain, the trauma written all over Sarah's face. The denial crumbled, replaced by something worse. Guilt. Guilt that this had happened under her roof. Guilt that she hadn't seen the signs. Guilt that she'd married Richard, that she'd trusted David, that she'd somehow failed to protect her daughter from the two men who'd destroyed her. Patricia started crying, sobbing actually, and Sarah found herself comforting her mother even though she was the victim, even though she was the one who needed comfort. "What do we do?" Patricia asked through her tears. "What do I do?" Tyler's answer was immediate. "We go to the police. We report both of them. We make sure they face consequences for what they did." But Patricia hesitated. "It's been weeks," she said. "There's no physical evidence anymore. It would be Sarah's word against theirs. And you know how these cases go. They'd drag Sarah through hell in court. They'd make her relive every detail. They'd try to destroy her credibility. I can't put her through that." Sarah spoke up then, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't want to report it. I just wanted you to know, Mom. I wanted you to know what kind of men they really are." Patricia made a decision right then that would haunt her forever. She told Richard to move out. Just like that, after years of marriage, she packed his things while he was at work and changed the locks. When he came home that evening, his belongings were on the front lawn and Patricia was waiting for him. He tried to talk to her, tried to come inside, but she stood in the doorway and said 3 words, "I know everything." The color drained from Richard's face. He started to stammer, to make excuses, but Patricia cut him off. "Get off my property. If you ever come near Sarah again, if you ever contact any of my children again, I will go to the police myself and tell them exactly what you did. Do you understand me?" Richard grabbed his things and left, but not before Marcus, who'd been waiting in his truck down the street, followed him to make sure he actually left and didn't try to circle back. David was next. Patricia called him and asked him to come over, said she needed to talk to him about something urgent. When he arrived, Patricia, Tyler, and Marcus were waiting for him. Patricia didn't beat around the bush. She confronted him directly, told him she knew what he'd done to Sarah, and if he ever came near her family again, she'd make sure everyone in their community knew exactly what kind of man he was. David tried to deny it at first, but when he saw the rage in Tyler and Marcus's eyes, when he realized they all knew and they all believed Sarah, he changed tactics. He tried to minimize it, said it wasn't as bad as Sarah was making it seem, that she'd misunderstood what happened. That was a mistake. Marcus lunged at him, and it took both Tyler and Patricia to hold him back. "Get out," Patricia said to her brother, her voice ice-cold. "You're dead to me. You're dead to all of us." For a few weeks, things seemed to settle into a new, painful normal. Richard and David stayed away. Sarah started seeing a therapist, working through her trauma, trying to rebuild her life, piece by piece. Tyler and Marcus checked in on her constantly, making sure she felt safe, making sure she knew they'd always be there for her. Patricia struggled with her own guilt and grief, mourning the loss of her marriage and her relationship with her brother, but never once blaming Sarah. If anything, she became fiercely protective of her daughter, determined to support her through whatever came next. But this story, this terrible story of betrayal and trauma, wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because Sarah's attackers, Richard and David, they weren't content to just disappear. They were angry. They felt entitled to access to the family, and their anger was about to set off a chain of events that would end in tragedy. 3 months after being kicked out of the family, Richard and David made a critical mistake. They showed up together at Sarah's apartment complex on a Saturday afternoon. Sarah had just gotten home from her shift at the restaurant where she worked, exhausted, and not paying attention to her surroundings. She was halfway across the parking lot when she heard her name being called. She turned around, and there they were, both of them, walking toward her with determined expressions on their faces. The panic that flooded through Sarah's body was immediate and overwhelming. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. They got closer, and Richard started talking, saying they needed to clear the air, saying Sarah had caused enough problems, and it was time to stop this nonsense and let things go back to normal. Sarah finally found her voice and screamed. Not words, just a raw, primal scream of fear and rage. A neighbor heard and came out of his apartment to see what was happening. Seeing a witness, Richard and David backed off, but not before David said something that would seal his fate. "You can't avoid us forever, Sarah. We're family. We'll always be part of your life, whether you like it or not." Then they left, got into David's truck, and drove away. Sarah collapsed right there in the parking lot, shaking so badly the neighbor had to help her inside and call 911 because he thought she was having a seizure. Tyler and Marcus arrived at the hospital before the ambulance even got Sarah there. They'd both been listed as her emergency contacts. When they found out what happened, that Richard and David had cornered their sister, had threatened her, had sent her into a full panic attack that landed her in the ER, something inside both brothers snapped. They'd been trying to do the right thing, trying to let the system work, trying to respect Sarah's wishes about not going to the police. But watching their sister lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to monitors, sedated because she couldn't stop hyperventilating, they made a decision. This ended now. They were going to handle this their own way. Marcus made some calls and found out that David had a routine. He stopped at the same bar every Thursday night after work, had a few beers, then drove home. Tyler found out through a friend who worked construction that Richard had picked up some temporary work on a site outside of town and was staying in a motel nearby. They made a plan. They'd wait until Thursday, follow David when he left the bar, and confront him somewhere private. They'd make it clear, in no uncertain terms, that if he or Richard ever came near Sarah again, there would be consequences. They weren't planning to kill anyone. They want to be very clear about that. They just wanted to scare them enough that they'd leave Sarah alone permanently. Thursday came, and Tyler and Marcus positioned themselves outside the bar David frequented. They'd brought along their friend Jake, someone they trusted, someone who'd been like a brother to them growing up. Just after 10 p.m., David stumbled out of the bar, clearly drunk, and got into his truck. They followed him, keeping their distance, waiting for him to pull over somewhere isolated. But David didn't pull over. He drove straight to Richard's motel, and when he got out of his truck, Richard came out of his room to meet him. The two men talked for a few minutes, Richard gesturing angrily, David nodding along, and then they both got into Richard's car and started driving. Tyler, Marcus, and Jake followed them out of town, down back roads, until Richard finally pulled over at an abandoned gas station about 20 miles from anywhere. This was it, the moment the brothers had been waiting for. They pulled up next to Richard's car, got out, and confronted both men right there under the flickering lights of the old gas station sign. "You were told to stay away from Sarah," Marcus said, his voice deadly calm. "You showed up at her apartment. You threatened her. She ended up in the hospital because of you." Richard tried to bluster, said they had every right to talk to Sarah, that she was being dramatic, that the whole family was overreacting. That was the wrong thing to say. What happened next, in the span of less than 15 minutes, would change all of their lives forever. The confrontation turned physical. Richard threw the first punch, hitting Tyler in the jaw, and all hell broke loose. It wasn't a fight. It was 5 men in a violent, chaotic brawl in the middle of nowhere with no one around to stop it. Tyler and Marcus, fueled by months of rage over what had been done to their sister, didn't hold back. Jake jumped in when he saw Richard pull out a knife. There was shouting, grunting, the sound of fists hitting flesh, bodies hitting the ground. And then, silence. The kind of silence that comes after something terrible has happened. Something irreversible. Richard was on the ground, not moving, blood pooling around his head from where it had struck the concrete curb when he fell. David was conscious but badly beaten, his face swollen, his breathing labored. Tyler, Marcus, and Jake stood there in shock, looking at what they'd done, trying to process what had just happened. They'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Richard's pulse was weak, but he was still alive. Barely. They had a choice to make in that moment. Call 911 and face the consequences. Or, they made the wrong choice. The choice that would haunt them forever. They put both men in the back of Richard's car, drove them even further out into the country, and left them in a field off a dirt road. Then they went home, cleaned themselves up, and tried to pretend it never happened. A farmer found Richard's body 2 days later. David was next to him, alive but barely, severely dehydrated and in critical condition. The police were called, an investigation was launched, and it didn't take long for them to piece together what had happened. Security footage from the bar showed David leaving with Tyler, Marcus, and Jake following shortly after. Witnesses at the motel confirmed seeing the three of them in the parking lot. Tire tracks and forensic evidence at the abandoned gas station sealed the case. Within a week, all three men, Tyler, Marcus, and Jake, were arrested and charged with assault, kidnapping, and in Richard's case, murder. The trial was a media sensation. The defense argued that Tyler and Marcus were acting to protect their sister from her abusers, that Richard and David had sexually assaulted Sarah and were continuing to harass and threaten her, and that the confrontation that night had escalated beyond anyone's control. The prosecution argued that regardless of what Richard and David had done, Tyler and Marcus had taken the law into their own hands, had ambushed two men, had beaten one of them to death, and had left them both to die in a field. They called it vigilante justice, cold-blooded revenge, premeditated murder. The community was divided. Some saw Tyler and Marcus as heroes who'd done what the justice system wouldn't do, protecting a victim when no one else would. Others saw them as murderers who'd crossed a line that should never be crossed. Sarah testified at the trial, telling her story publicly for the first time.